October 25, 1943, 04:42 hours, Simpson Harbor, Rabaul. A light drizzle flickered over the harbor as the Imperial Japanese Navy supply flotilla sat at anchor, silent and blacked out under a moonless sky. 12 vessels rocked gently in the Pacific swells, 2 transports, 1 tanker, and a screen of destroyers set in diamond formation. Above them, the cliffs of New Britain watched in silence, carved with anti-aircraft batteries dug into the rock like black teeth. Lieutenant Commander Shoji Fujikawa stood on the deck of the destroyer Amatsukaze, peering through binoculars. The smell of diesel oil mixed with salt water and soot. 2 nights earlier, they had narrowly avoided a torpedo run by American subs southeast of Kavieng. Tonight, they expected silence. Maybe a recon plane at most. What he heard instead was the sound of skipping stones. Faint at first, almost playful, a rhythmic splash-splash thunk, followed by an eerie whistle. Then the Amatsukaze lurched violently sideways, a geyser of steel and flame erupting beneath its hull. The deck pitched, men screamed, and in an instant the quiet harbor became a killing ground. The bombs hadn't come from above. They had bounced across the water. What Fujikawa witnessed that morning was not a torpedo strike. It was skip bombing. And Japan was completely unprepared for it. The American 5th Air Force had launched 47 North American B-25 Mitchell bombers from WWII in Papua New Guinea. Each one carried 500-pound general-purpose bombs fitted with delayed fuses and armed with low-level fusing rods. But they weren't flying at 10,000 feet. They came in at mast height, 200 knots, engines screaming just 50 feet above the ocean, low enough that sea spray coated the undersides of their wings. Skip bombing was born from desperation in the South Pacific. Too many bombs missed from altitude. Too many Japanese ships slipped away in the night. The Americans decided to aim lower, much lower. Now the bombs weren't dropped to fall, they were dropped to bounce. Like stones skipping across a pond, each one leapt across the waves, slammed into a ship's hull and detonated beneath it, exactly where steel was weakest. It was naval execution by blunt force trauma. At 04:44, 2 B-25s roared into Simpson Harbor, flying so low their engines chopped palm fronds from the ridge above. The lead plane nosed down and released 2 bombs. Each one skipped twice, then punched clean into the starboard quarter of the freighter Hakusen Maru. The delay fuses allowed a heartbeat of silence. Then the ocean opened. The explosion lifted the freighter out of the water, the shockwave folding its midsection like a tin toy. A fireball burst skyward as the ship cracked in half, burning oil turning the harbor's surface into a mirror of flame. Commander Fujikawa staggered as his ship rolled under the pressure wave. "Enemy torpedoes!" someone shouted. "No," Fujikawa roared back, eyes wide. "Those aren't torpedoes, those are bombs." He had never seen anything like it. No dive angle, no overhead silhouette. Just shadowy shapes skimming over the waves, faster than the eye could track, bombs falling horizontally, bouncing once, twice, then detonating like depth charges in reverse. Within 5 minutes, the Hakusen Maru, Ryuan Maru no 2, and the oiler Yamyuki Maru were burning wrecks. Every anti-aircraft battery opened fire, tracers clawing the sky in red fury. But it was too late. The B-25s were already gone, vanished back into the Black Sea spray before any Japanese gun could find its mark. From above, the lead B-25's nose gunner, Sergeant Joe Laskowski, leaned into his turret. His fingers were slick with sweat. His eyes flicked between the flickering tracer streams and the black bulk of the next freighter growing larger in the window. "Target dead ahead," the pilot called. "Let him skip." The bombardier dropped another pair. Joe watched the 2 bombs bounce once hard, throwing up walls of seawater. They disappeared under the ship's keel. 2 seconds later, A column of water taller than a warehouse swallowed the ship's bow. "Hit," Joe shouted. "That's a hit." They didn't stay to watch it sink. They never did. These missions weren't about staying. They were about punching, vanishing, and letting the physics do the rest. The next wave came in minutes later. 10 B-25s modified with forward-firing .50 caliber machine guns. Each plane packed up to 12 guns in the nose and wings, turning the Mitchell into a flying battering ram. As they descended toward the harbor, the gunships opened fire, their bullets walking across the decks of surviving ships, cutting down crewmen scrambling for the AA stations. The low hum of .50 cals filled the air like a meat grinder chewing steel. Fujikawa's helmsman slumped forward, blood spraying from a dozen impact points. Fujikawa himself fired his sidearm at the sky in desperation, screaming orders no one could hear. They weren't fighting planes. They were fighting velocity. By 05:06 the harbor was hell. 7 ships burned. 2 were gone completely, their hulls vanished below the foam. The others were listing, crippled, or vomiting smoke into the still dark sky. The first Japanese officer to understand the attack fully, that this wasn't traditional bombing, wasn't torpedoes, wasn't anything they'd trained for, was Captain Katsuro Hida, aboard the crippled transport Teijin Maru. He watched the final B-25 wave skip its bombs like deadly stones across the ocean. Each one arced through the mist, slapped the water, and struck home with bone-breaking precision. His voice shook as he muttered, "It is not a bombing, it is a game, and we are the stones." By dawn, silence returned to Simpson Harbor. The smoke drifted inland. The water was coated in oil debris and the bodies of sailors who never even saw their killers. What the Japanese couldn't admit yet, what the Americans had discovered, was that high-altitude precision bombing was obsolete in the South Pacific. B-25s, flown low and fast, could do what torpedoes could not. They could kill ships not from the sky, but from the sea. At 06:40, one final B-25, separated from its group, buzzed the harbor in a lone strafe run. It didn't drop a bomb. But as it pulled up, its pilot banked, giving the Japanese defenders a perfect view of the white star on the fuselage. Fujikawa, bloodied and stunned, whispered the name burned into his memory. Mitchell. What the Japanese faced that morning wasn't new technology. It was new thinking. And it detonated under their keels, like a torpedo delivered by wind and steel. The harbor still hissed with fire when the sun finally pierced the smoke. The waters around Rabaul shimmered with oil slicks, floating life vests, and torn sheets of iron that had once been hull plates. Nothing moved. Even the seabirds were silent. Commander Shoji Fujikawa stood on the sloped deck of the crippled Amatsukaze, staring out at the wreckage with unblinking eyes. Crewmen dragged bodies from the water with bamboo poles. The scent of fuel and blood hung over everything. He had survived torpedo runs, submarine ambushes, and dive bombers, but this had come from nowhere. The American planes hadn't dropped from the clouds. They had skimmed in beneath the radar below the guns, too fast to track, and they hadn't aimed for the decks. They'd aimed under them. He had no words for it yet, but deep down he knew this wasn't just a new technique. This was a shift in doctrine, a preview of how Japan's steel would keep breaking for the rest of the war. Back in his command bunker, his voice trembled as he reported to 8th Fleet Command. The bombs skipped. They did not fall, they skipped across the water, and they hit us below the armor line. We had no warning, and we had no answer. There was no reply for several seconds. Then, from the other end, understood. But Fujikawa knew they didn't, not yet. At Dabajura, Colonel Paul Pappy, gun, walked the flight line slowly, inspecting each B-25's scorched belly and nose glass smeared with streaks of jungle insects and dried salt. He carried a rag in his hand, and wiped the soot from the nose of each bomber like a priest blessing battle-worn armor. They had done it again, a raid with minimal losses and maximum destruction. Gunn had pushed for this tactic, modifying the Mitchells himself. He ripped out the bombardier stations, replaced them with clusters of .50 caliber machine guns. His crews flew so low they came home with coconut fronds stuck in their engine cowlings. It was insane, it was reckless, and it worked. The secret was not just in the altitude, it was in the math. Traditional high-altitude bombing had a hit rate below 20%. Skip bombing at 200 knots and 50 feet, over 70% effective against stationary shipping. The enemy couldn't track you, couldn't shoot fast enough, and had no time to maneuver. The bombs skipped like stones, and then they sank ships. And Gunn's pilots were getting good at it. Sergeant Joe Laskowski sat cross-legged in the dirt, his flight jacket unzipped, his skin still sticky from adrenaline and tropical heat. He was cleaning his nose turret again, even though it was already spotless. "You know what the Japanese called it," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "The sky always came down from above. Not anymore. We're bringing it in sideways now." The new guys laughed nervously, but Joe wasn't smiling. He'd watched an entire freighter lift out of the water like a toy after one of their bombs struck her dead center. That image wouldn't leave him. Not the explosion, but the silence just before it. The moment when the bomb skipped once, twice, and then vanished under the keel. Like it had a mind of its own. Admiral Kusaka of the Japanese 8th Fleet summoned his air officers and engineers to an emergency conference 2 hours after the raid. The room was hot and cramped, the air thick with cigarette smoke and sweat. No one looked anyone else in the eye. "Anti-aircraft batteries cannot depress far enough," one officer admitted. "They are designed for dive angles, not for horizontal threats." Another chimed in. "Radar didn't catch them. They came in under the signal cone, at sea level." "And torpedo nets are useless," said a third. "These are not torpedoes. The bombs jump over the nets." Kusaka didn't speak for a long moment. Then he leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Then we must teach our gunners to shoot level. And we must camouflage our ships, scatter them, never moor them in predictable formation. If they strike us from below, we will strike them from above." But no one said how. Japan's best Zero pilots were already bleeding in the Solomons. Fuel was scarce. Airfields were crumbling, and the B-25s were multiplying. They had thought American bombers would always come from the stratosphere, like the B-17s. They had prepared for altitude. No one had prepared for the sound of 4-engine thunder, coming straight at the water. 2 weeks later, the Americans hit Kavieng. This time, the B-25s came in over the reef, hugging the surf like predators. The lead pilot saw the AA tracers rise above his plane, useless, like throwing stones at a train that had already passed. The targets were moving this time. 3 coastal freighters, zigzagging at 14 knots, trying to reach open water. The first skip bomb skipped twice, slammed amidships, and flipped the freighter on its side in seconds. The second hit too low and detonated under the keel, tearing out the entire engine compartment and lifting the stern clear of the water before the ship broke in half. The third missed. Even God didn't get 100%. But 2 out of 3 was enough. On board the cruiser Katori, Captain Shunpei Yuta watched the carnage from the bridge. He didn't give orders. There was nothing to order. The Americans didn't come in waves. They came in lines, a straight rush of bombers skimming so low they disappeared behind the ocean's own curvature, only to reappear too late to stop. "They fly like madmen," his first officer whispered. "No," Yuta replied, voice low. "They fly like they don't care if they die, because they know they won't." Back in New Guinea, Colonel Gunn watched film footage from the nose cameras. You could see the ship growing larger, the bombs skipping like stones in perfect sequence. the impact blooming into towering columns of water and fire. His engineers began adjusting the fuses. Delays set to 0.3 seconds, enough for the bomb to strike, enter the hull just beneath the waterline, and explode after penetration. The ships no longer sank. They vanished. By December 1943, Japanese commanders began issuing new standing orders. No ship was to anchor in harbor without double picket patrols. Radar installations were to be recalibrated downward, but it was all reaction, never preparation. The B-25s kept coming. To Wewak, to Madang, to Kavieng again, to shipping lanes that once felt safe. The bombers were no longer just attackers. They were rumors, myths whispered among frightened sailors. They come from the water. They skip their bombs like pebbles. They don't fly over, they fly through. And in every harbor hit, the same image remained. Black smoke curling over calm waters, and the echo of a strike that had never come from above. On January 6, 1944, the Imperial Japanese Navy recorded its first official term for the phenomenon, Swayman-Danya Bakuden, surface skipping bombs. A naval research team filed a request to develop countermeasures. It was too late. By the time the report reached Tokyo, 3 more transports were already burning near Sedor. In the air, Joe Laskowski leaned over his gun sights and whispered the same phrase every time they ran the approach. "Skip one for me." And every time, the Pacific answered with a column of water and the thunder of steel breaking in half. The jungle canopy near Madang shimmered with humidity. From above, it looked like untouched paradise, lush, green, eternal. But beneath the palms, Japanese engineers dragged iron plates through knee-deep mud, straining to lay a temporary pier for an ammunition barge scheduled to arrive by midnight. Corporal Yamazaki watched the work from a bamboo lean-to. He hadn't slept in 30 hours. His Arasaka was clean. His boots were soaked, and in the distance, barely audible, there was a sound like bees, faint, rhythmic, distant. Engines, but not above. They came in low, always low now. The guards reached for searchlights, but it was already too late. The B-25s came skimming up the coast at 180 feet below the treetops, shadows dancing across the surf. Their bomb bays opened over the water, not the pier. The first bomb skipped once, twice, then struck the side of the barge just as it began to turn. The steel hull lifted, split, and vanished in a spray of black oil and flame. The shockwave buckled the dock like matchsticks. The pier collapsed before a single shot had been fired. Yamazaki ran. He didn't even remember doing it. His boots pounded through the mud. Behind him, explosions bloomed like flowers on the tide. By the time he returned, the barge was gone, the fuel was gone, the pier was gone, and his sergeant stood ankle-deep in the surf, weeping. Back at WWII, Colonel Gunn looked over the new flight logs and mission reports. 35 sorties. 78 bombs dropped. 52 confirmed hits. 12 enemy vessels destroyed. Not a single B-25 lost. It wasn't just success, it was dominance. Pilots wrote home describing the runs like poetry. The bombs skipped so perfectly it felt like they wanted to hit. The freighter came apart like it was made of sugar. We flew so low, I saw the ship's cook dive into the water with a frying pan still in his hand. Some of it was bravado, but not all. Gunn knew what the skip bombers had become, not just a new tactic, but a new kind of psychological warfare. The Japanese had designed their convoys and harbor defenses for vertical threats. They were dug in above. Their gunners pointed upward. But skip bombing came from eye level, sudden, brutal, and impossible to stop. And worse, it looked easy. It was. Every run came with the risk of flying straight into the teeth of light machine gun nests, into the flak bubble, into waters laced with splinters and wreckage. A single miscalculation, and the bomber became a flaming cartwheel across the water. But the pilots kept flying low, and the ships kept dying. At Imperial Navy headquarters in Truk Lagoon, the mood had turned grim. Admiral Kusaka, once a stalwart advocate of island-hopping defense, now sat in silence as younger officers presented loss charts. Freighter losses in the Solomons and Bismarck Sea had tripled since the skip bombing raids began. Oil tankers had to run in darkness, zigzagging even inside lagoons. One officer cleared his throat. "We are no longer safe even when anchored. They skip the bombs, sir, right into the water, and then under us." Kusaka tapped his pipe against the ashtray, his voice like gravel. "Aerial torpedoes. No, contact bombs with time delay. Skip bombed from low altitude. And we have no counters." Silence. Only one officer dared speak. "We believe. They're training their pilots to fly at treetop height. It's suicide, but they keep coming." Kusaka stared at the ceiling, then stood. He said only one thing before leaving the room. "Then we are at war with men who are not afraid to die." At Sedor, the 5th Air Force launched a mission unlike any before. 18 B-25s all-skip bombers, no high-altitude cover, no fighter escorts. The target, a convoy of 6 ships trying to ferry artillery from Mading to Wewak under cover of twilight. The American formation appeared at dusk, gliding over the breakers like shadows, sun gleaming off their wings. They came in pairs, each pair focused on a single ship. No warnings, no sirens, just the roar of engines at sea level. Every pilot had trained for weeks, diving, leveling, dropping, letting the bomb bounce twice for ideal trajectory. Bombs that skipped too short would glance off, too long and they'd dive early. The lead pair hit a destroyer. First bomb skipped clean over the deck and exploded mid-air. The second bounced under the hull and blew the keel apart. The ship's stern rose like a breaking wave and shattered down in a burst of foam and steel. The second pair hit the transport Sanriku Maru, breaking her spine midship. Ammunition onboard cooked off seconds later. The explosion painted the sky orange. Even from 12,000 feet, a passing recon plane saw the bloom and radioed. Entire ship disappeared, gone in flash. The last Japanese vessel tried to beach itself, but by then the gunships had arrived, 12 forward-firing B-25s that raked its decks until no crew remained. By nightfall, the convoy was erased, not damaged, not scattered, erased. In Tokyo, a young lieutenant in the Naval Air Department compiled after-action reports from survivors, trying to build a profile of the American tactic. His notes were meticulous. Bombs dropped at 50-80 feet. Delayed fuse 0 to 4 seconds. Skip distance 100-250 meters. Optimal ship speed for target under 10 knots. Attack angle perpendicular or oblique. But at the bottom of the page, he added a final line, underlined in red. Effective range of defensive fire, functionally 0. Time from visual contact to impact is insufficient for coordinated response. He put down his pencil. He understood. The problem wasn't just the bombs. It was the speed of inevitability. By April 1944, the U.S. had turned skip bombing into a full doctrine. They taught it at Nadzeb, Port Moresby, and later on Bayek. Entire classes of B-25 crews were trained not to fly above the war, but through it. The technique became so refined that bombardiers would actually count the number of wave crests before releasing, adjusting for sea state, wind, and ship speed. The skip was no longer a gamble. It was geometry, applied with fury. At Palau, Japanese soldiers dug dummy harbors with decoy ships made of bamboo and painted canvas. They prayed the Americans would waste bombs on ghosts. But the B-25s flew past them. They didn't strike illusions. They aimed for steel. In July 1944, the waters around the Philippines turned dark with smoke. Convoys that once moved under the cover of darkness were now visible targets by day, death traps by night. Japanese captains began refusing to travel except under typhoon conditions, anything to mask their position from the skip bombers. Even then, the sea betrayed them. The B-25s didn't need ideal weather, they just needed angles. At Tacloban, 3 freighters had just finished unloading rifles and rice. The convoy prepared to pull out under low cloud. Radar was blind. The lookouts saw nothing. Then the sky opened not above but behind the wave line. 2 B-25s came over the surf so low their propellers kicked up mist. Each dropped 2 bombs, 4 splashes, 4 skips. 4 hits. By the time the lead freighter exploded, the second pair was already diving into their attack run. 1 bomb struck under the stern and lifted the entire rear section out of the water. The rest of the ship cracked forward, folded, and disappeared like it had never been built. A survivor later wrote, "We never saw the planes until the bombs hit the water. By then, it was like watching death arrive across glass." The 5th Air Force crews had refined their technique to such precision that they no longer called it skip bombing. They called it surgery. Pilots no longer aimed for ships. They aimed for water-specific patches, at specific speeds, from specific altitudes. They knew the arc. They knew the trajectory. They knew the keel line of every class of Japanese freighter. It was no longer experimental. It was doctrine. The water closed over it like nothing had happened. On Christmas Eve, survivors from 4 separate ships floated near the shores of Luzon, their lifeboats drifting among wreckage. They didn't talk about their cargo or their mission. They talked about the sound. The impossible, eerie sound. That split second when the bomb skipped across the water and vanished under their hull, the stillness, the hush, just before the world flipped upside down. One man, bleeding from his shoulder, whispered, "It's not war anymore, it's geometry with vengeance." By the end of 1944, American analysts stopped measuring skip bombing effectiveness in terms of hits. They started measuring it in terms of what didn't get hit. That list was short. And getting shorter. The convoy routes to Palawan, Cebu, and Formosa tightened into desperate threads. Every shipment became a roll of loaded dice. Every Japanese port became a waiting room for the next raid. And always from the horizon came the same signature. No high altitude. No warning. No sirens. Just the sudden roar of propellers at sea level. And the splash-splash thump of a bomb that wasn't falling. It was skipping. The last time Lieutenant Commander Shoji Fujikawa saw a fully loaded Japanese convoy, it was January 3, 1945. 6 merchantmen and 4 destroyers formed a tight diamond formation south of Formosa, each vessel stacked with ammunition, rice, spare parts, and wounded. They never made it to Luzon. The escort radar picked up blips at 0613. At first, they assumed it was another PBY patrol, slow and high, a manageable threat. But within minutes, the radar image dissolved into chaos. The blips split, accelerated, dropped to sea level. Visual confirmation came too late. B-25s. 4 flights, 8 bombers each, flying no higher than the bridge windows, approaching directly over the horizon at mast level. The sea was calm. No chop, perfect skip conditions. The first bombs struck like trained animals, leaping off the surface, slapping steel with the precision of a surgeon. One freighter's forward hold burst open like a tin can under pressure. Another took a bomb amidships and split along its center line before rolling under. Fujikawa tried to direct anti-aircraft fire, but no one could track anything. The planes were beneath the elevation arc of the guns. The gunners fired too late, too high, or not at all. Smoke clouded the formation in seconds. Half the ships were either burning or sinking before the second wave even arrived. The Mitchells didn't circle. They didn't dogfight. They punched and disappeared, roaring back into the mist like phantoms. By 07:04 the sea was still again. 5 ships had vanished. The rest drifted, dead in the water, radioing for rescue. Fujikawa heard the last words of the Sendai Maru's radioman just before the signal cut out. They did not fly, they skimmed. It was the same across the Pacific. In the South China Sea, in the Bismarck Archipelago, in the narrow straits off Palawan, every major convoy suffered skip-bombing losses. It wasn't just attrition. It was system failure. Fuel shortages worsened. Ammunition failed to arrive. Artillery positions remained unfed. Entire divisions starved on isolated islands because their rice convoys never came back. A new phrase began to circulate through surviving garrisons. Even the ocean serves the Americans now. And with every raid, every clean strike under the keel, the belief that Japan could win slipped further away. Back in the Philippines, Private First Class Yashiro Takahashi crouched inside a palm-lined trench north of Clark Field. His unit was down to 13 men, no radio, no trucks, and no clean water. They hadn't eaten in 2 days. A resupply barge had been scheduled for delivery 3 nights ago. It had been skip-bombed before it reached shore. Now, even the sound of airplane engines over water made the men flinch. The bombs no longer needed to hit their foxholes. Denial of supplies was enough. When a single-engine recon plane buzzed overhead that morning, one of Takahashi's comrades fired his last cartridge into the sky out of reflex. Not at the plane, at the fear. The ocean, once Japan's imperial pathway, had become a graveyard. In Tokyo, the Naval Ministry received one final analysis from the Southern Area Fleet. It read, "Skip bombing has rendered fixed harbor defense obsolete. No ship is safe at anchor. Shore-based anti-aircraft guns fail to engage effectively below 12 meters altitude. Convoy losses exceed replaceable tonnage. Tactical adjustment is no longer sufficient. Strategic parity is irrecoverable." No one contested it, not anymore. It was submitted to the War Ministry under a single heading, Terminal Maritime Collapse. At the same time, Allied commanders refined their next campaign around skip-bombing dominance. The B-25 units were retasked to work in tandem with PT boats and submarines, forming a kill web around the last arteries of the Japanese supply network. The bombers cut the convoys. The subs cut the survivors. The fighters picked apart the lifeboats. It wasn't strategy anymore. It was inevitability executed in fragments. Captain Lowell Bricker returned to the Philippines in March 1945 for his final combat sortie. He flew lead in a 4-ship skip-bombing run against a convoy, attempting to reinforce the coast near Zamboanga. Visibility was poor, light rain, high crosswind, the kind of weather that used to give pilots pause. Not him, not anymore. He took the Mitchell down to 60 feet, wings skimming tree lines. His gunner opened fire a full second early, strafing the decks while Bricker lined up the shot. 2 bombs released. One skipped long, the other struck low. A freighter burst like a crushed drum. They pulled up into the mist before the enemy could return fire. As they banked, Bricker glanced out the window and saw something that stayed with him forever. A Japanese sailor clinging to a piece of driftwood waving a white cloth, not in surrender, in acknowledgement, not of mercy, of defeat. By May 1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy's merchant fleet had collapsed to less than 12% of its pre-war capacity. Of that remainder, less than half were considered seaworthy under fire. Entire island garrisons vanished not in battle but in silence, cut off, left behind, starving to death without ever seeing the enemy, It wasn't bombs or bullets that killed them. It was absence. Skip bombing had done what the fleet could not. It had strangled Japan from the ocean in. When the war ended in August, many Japanese officers refused to believe it was the atomic bomb that sealed their fate. Major General Sato, in a Tokyo briefing room, said simply, "We were defeated before Hiroshima. We were defeated when the ocean betrayed us." He said it with no bitterness, just finality. The ocean had not betrayed them, of course. It had simply changed allegiances to the men who could command its surface with bomb fins and .50 cals. Back at WWII, the B-25 crews stood in loose formation as news of the surrender was read aloud. Some cheered. Some didn't react at all. Sergeant Joe Laskowski didn't say a word. He just looked down at the nose of his Mitchell and traced the faint grooves where salt spray had worn through the paint. He remembered every run, every skip, every time the bomb danced once, twice, and vanished under a ship like it had chosen the exact spot to die. He didn't feel triumph. He felt gravity. After the war, when the Navy and Air Force debated procurement, one colonel said, "Skip bombing didn't just kill ships. It killed an empire's supply chain, one bounce at a time." Another officer nodded and replied, "It was the only weapon we had that used the ocean as an accomplice." Years later, in a Tokyo Maritime Museum, there was an exhibit showing the damage to a Japanese destroyer's keel, folded inward like a crumpled soda can. The caption read, "Struck by unexploded ordnance, exact type unknown." But the American pilot who dropped the bomb had no doubts. It was a skip, and it had landed exactly where he aimed. Not on deck, not from the clouds, but from the sea. Like vengeance that understood physics.